Okay, so this is the second half of the video lecture on public opinion, in which I will talk about political socialization and agents of socialization and polling as well.
Now, how do people develop those political ideologies? They do it through something known as political socialization, which is the process through which underlying political beliefs and values are formed. There are agents of socialization that actually cause that process to happen. And those agents are social institutions like families, schools, that tend to shape our basic political beliefs and values. So let's take a closer look at some of these really important agents of socialization. For one, family. Children, on average, tend to adopt the political views of their parents. And when I say on average, I'm sure we could find examples of people who do not have the same political views as their parents. But on average, children do tend to follow in the political footsteps of their parents. Social networks are a huge factor at shaping political opinions. Peer influence is very significant. And in the last couple of decades, online social networks such as Facebook and Twitter have really increased their profile in helping to shape opinions. And they've also become a source of news, which is increasingly becoming the preferred option for people when it comes to accessing news. Other agents of socialization include education, race and ethnicity, and gender. And to give you an example, the gender gap is the name that's given to the differences that men and women often have on a broad range of issues. So men and women tend to disagree on, not everything, but on some things. And that gap in how men and women disagree on political issues is called the gender gap. And it's a really important concept to understand. Other social group influences include religion, party affiliation, economic class and group self-interest, and political environment. And political environment essentially means what's happening around us, what's happening outside of our home, out in society, in the country. That can have a huge impact. For instance, the Great Depression in the 1930s had a huge impact on a generation of Americans. And in fact, it led to the Democratic Party controlling the House of Representatives for almost 40 years in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Now, what's interesting is that it seems as though public opinion would be a really democratic aspect to our political system, but political scientists would say that usually citizens who are more affluent, meaning wealthy and educated, have a bigger influence over policy decisions because they tend to vote at higher rates. They tend to be more politically knowledgeable. They pay attention more. They tend to get involved more. And they tend to contribute more to campaigns. So the relationship between what the public wants and what government actually does isn't cut and dry. There's a lot that factors into it, including different income levels. Other forces that shape public opinion, especially when it comes to people who are really engaged with politics, include political leaders and the media. Those are two really significant factors in shaping public opinion in what we call the marketplace of ideas. We're going to take a closer look now at how we measure public opinion. This is really important. So the way that we measure public opinion are through public opinion polls. These are scientific instruments to measure what Americans are feeling about a certain thing or thinking about a certain thing. And remember, elections at the national level only happen every 2 years. And so in between those 2 years, how do we know what the public wants? Well, that's where polls come in. Constantly we're getting polls on how Congress is doing, how the president is doing, how the public feels about certain issues like gun control or whether we should initiate military action in a certain part of the world. So polls can help political leaders decide how to approach something in between elections. And then, of course, leading up to elections, they're also very important. Now, it's impossible, it would be totally impossible if we were to take a survey, other than in an election, of every single registered voter in the country. That's a couple 100 million people. So what we have to do when we take a poll is we take something known as a sample, which is a small group selected by researchers to represent the most important characteristics of an entire population. A sample must be large enough to provide an accurate representation of the population. That's typically going to be between 500 and sometimes even up to 3,000. So it's really important when you're looking at a poll, you have to look at factors including the sample size. So if we're looking at a poll that has 500 registered voters, and then we're looking at another poll and it has 2,000 likely voters, that second poll is going to be so much more reliable and accurate because, first of all, not all registered voters show up to the polls. If it's 60%, that's actually really good turnout. So usually at least 40% of registered voters are staying home. So we want to focus on the people who are most likely to vote. So likely voters are the people who showed up in the last election and previous elections. So we want to poll as many of those people as we can. The other thing that happens when you have a sample is that sometimes there can be little errors that happen. So depending on how you give the poll, let's say that a polling company wants to call people and ask them a question about how the president is doing. Let's say that they use landlines. Not many people use those in the current contemporary age, but older people tend to use them more often than younger people. So if a polling company is going to use landline telephones, they may end up reaching more older people. So then what they have to do is they have to weight their sample to basically take into account that they may not be getting to all the people that they want to get to because they want that sample to be representative of the entire country. The percentages in that sample should match the percentages of the demographics of the rest of the country. Meaning, if 60% of Americans are white, or let's say 60% of likely voters are white, you want to have 60% of that sample be white. If, say, 70% of likely voters are people who are over the age of 50, well, then you'd want to have the same percentage in your sample. But sometimes, for different reasons, you might end up with those different groups being over or underrepresented in your sample. For example, in the case that I gave in which they're using landlines and they tend to get more older people responding because they are the ones with landlines, you would need to weight your sample to basically give fewer points, I guess you could say, to those older folks, and you give more points to younger folks. So for every one younger person that they end up getting a hold of, they were going to count that person as double. Whereas with older folks, maybe each older person they talk to really counts for half of a respondent. So that's a really simplistic way of describing that, but that's what weighting is. And because we're only looking at a slice of the population, oftentimes polls can have something known as a sampling error, which is a margin of error. And typically, really good polls will have a margin of error of 3%, but it can go up to 5%. Usually 3 to 5% is the margin of error that political polls have. The other thing is that when you design a political poll, you have to be really careful because sometimes if you write the poll question the wrong way, people will respond in a way you weren't intending. So question wording has to be something that's really scientifically crafted, otherwise you might get another type of sampling error. So if you have poor question format, if the questions are even in the wrong order, if you use the wrong words, if they're just not very clear, or if you write a question that is as somewhat of a built-in bias, it can totally throw off the whole poll and again result in unreliability, sampling errors, and the like. Here's an example, okay? Here's some different ways that we could ask something. So let's say that we had a situation in which we're going to go all the way back to 2000. Let's say pollsters were asking what should be done with the nation's budget surplus, which we had at the time. And let's say we wanted to take a closer look at what the president at the time, Bill Clinton, could have done. Okay, so down here, variation one. This is one way in which the poll could have been asked. Should the money be used for a tax cut or should it be used to fund new government programs? Well, I can tell you that typically in polls, people tend to not support the idea of bigger government. If I were to ask you, hey, would you support bigger government? Typically, the idea of bigger government, especially in the United States, is not something that people are really supportive of. But if we rephrase that, they might support it. So let's look at variation two. Should the money be used for a tax cut, or should it be spent on programs for education, the environment, healthcare, crime fighting, and military defense? Typically, the public supports all of those things. So you're probably going to get a higher percentage of people say yes to that question than they would to variation one. They're asking the same thing. That's why it's important to make sure that polls are written in a very scientific way. So what else causes inaccurate poll results? A couple of things. There's something known as the social desirability effect. And this is where people respond to surveys in a way in which they want the interviewer, and when I say interviewer, the person who might be calling to ask them the question, because a lot of these surveys are a real person calling and asking the question. When a respondent wants the interviewer to like them, they may respond in a way that doesn't really match what they're actually thinking. And one example of this would be in previous decades where you had a candidate of color or a black candidate who was running, and survey interviewers would ask people, do you intend to vote for this candidate? Respondents did not want to look racist, so there would be a higher percentage of people who said yes to the survey interviewer, but then actually did not plan on voting for those candidates of color when they went into the local ballot location. Another cause of inaccurate poll results would be selection bias, and what this is when a sample is not representative of the population being studied. Really easy example here, if I were to take a survey of our section, right, that's roughly 50 college students, and then I were to say, based on the results of that survey, that all Americans believe this same thing, that would be selection bias, because obviously the majority of Americans are not college students from your specific age group. So that would create an error in overrepresenting or underrepresenting opinions. A couple of other causes of inaccurate poll results. Push polls. This is where a polling company maybe has an ulterior motive. They want to be able to advertise certain polling results, so they write the poll question on purpose in a way to mislead. So this is a polling technique involving questions that are biased in their wording and are designed to provoke a response that the interviewer is seeking. So it's really important to be skeptical. If an interviewer asks you a survey question and it just doesn't sound right, it sounds a little misleading, or maybe it seems a little biased, then it could be a push poll. And then another cause of inaccurate poll results would be the bandwagon effect. This is where people, tend to support the front runner because they like a winner, so to speak. That can be kind of brief and it can be overstated, especially in the media, because then the media tends to focus on the fact that that person is leading, and people oftentimes will get swayed by that media reporting. But the people who are responding to the polls may not be the most likely people to go vote. And the people who are usually more likely to vote, they tend to have a more solid idea and they may not shift as much in that bandwagon effect. So that's why it could lead to an inaccurate poll result. And there is a wide range of accuracy when it comes to different political polls. We're looking here at this graphic. This is a graphic that shows the wide range in accuracy of final pre-election polls from the 2016 presidential election. As you can see, way down at the bottom here, we had the Associated Press. They had President Trump losing by 13 percentage points. Okay, that's what that means. And then way up here on the other side, we had the LA Times and the USC poll. They had Trump winning by 3 percentage points. Now, this is looking at the national popular vote, essentially. This is not looking at the Electoral College. And you can see that the overwhelming majority, all but 2 polling firms, had Donald Trump losing in that election. Some by at least 3 to 4 percentage points, which is actually decisive. Okay, but that would be within the margin of error. So we know the result. Donald Trump won that election. Only 2 polling outfits predicted that. So what this should tell you is that polling, even though there's a lot of science that goes into trying to make the best polling questions and the best surveys and the most accurate results, it's still not an exact science. Now, speaking of poll accuracy, you are now going to go into the discussion question section of Canvas, and you're going to answer the first discussion question of the week, which looks at why it's important for polls to be accurate. And you're also going to take a look at some of the rankings online for which polls are considered to be the best. So once you're in the discussion question, you may already be in that section of Canvas if that's where you're choosing to watch this video. Once you're done with the video, you're going to come down to where it says number 2 here, and you're going to click this link to read an article about efforts to make polls more accurate after the 2016 election. Then you're going to come back, and after you're finished reading the article, you're going to answer these questions here. And that includes visiting another link to take a look at a scale of different pollsters and how accurate they are. So that concludes the first part of the weekly lecture. This section focused on public opinion. Go ahead and now start the second section, which focuses on the media. Thanks for watching.